learners, in the previous session we had discussed William Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads. We had begun that session by explaining the historical and literary background of the Lyrical Ballads, the how and why of its publication, and a brief outline of its various editions. Thereafter, we had elaborated upon three aspects of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, namely A. The definition of poetry, B. The characteristics of a poet, and C. The subject matter, function, as well as the value of poetry. Today, in this session, we shall be looking at the fourth aspect of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, which is the language of poetry. Thereafter, we shall also briefly mention the four stages of poetic creation according to Wordsworth. Following the discussion of these two aspects, we shall also be talking about Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry. Now let's begin with the fourth aspect of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, which is the language of poetry. Wordsworth's theory of the language of poetry was not merely a reaction against and a criticism of the neoclassical theory of poetic diction. It also comprised his serious and deliberate intent to find a suitable language for the new territory of human life which he was conquering for poetic treatment. His aim was to advocate simplicity of theme, simplicity of language, as opposed to the lofty themes and affected language used by neoclassical writers such as John Dryden and Alexander Pope, which Wordsworth condemned as a masquerade of tricks, quaintness, and hieroglyphics, and enigmas in his appendix to the Lyrical Ballads 1802. Wordsworth asserted that the use of and adherence to poetic diction alienated the common man from poetry, as the common man did not speak in figurative language or use elevated vocabulary. Wordsworth, therefore, refused to abide by the formality, complexity, artifice, and classical rules of unity that were seen as essential by the neoclassicists. As Wordsworth wrote in his essay on epitaphs 1810, and I quote, "If words be not the incarnation of the thought, but only a clothing for it, if words be not the incarnation of the thought, but only a clothing for it, then surely they will prove an ill gift." Unquote. In other words, language is not the outer clothing of thought and therefore separate from thought, but instead language is the exemplification, the direct manifestation of thought itself. Since every individual poet's mode of experience is peculiar to him, this experience will find expression in a style appropriate to it. Consequently, no general poetic style can be prescribed for all poets to follow in a ubiquitous fashion. Therefore, we see that Wordsworth preached a poetic style that is organic and not prescriptive. In his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth advocated elimination of poetic diction in the following words that I quote, "I have taken as much pains to avoid it as others ordinarily take to produce it. This I have done for the reason already alleged, to bring my language near to the language of men, and further because the pleasure which I have proposed to myself to impart is of a kind very different from that which is supposed by many persons to be the proper object of poetry." Unquote. In the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth's purpose or principal object, as he himself says, was to choose incidents and situations from common life by tracing in them the primary laws of our nature. Additionally, these incidents must be expressed in the language of poetry, which is a selection of the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation. What we must remember here is that there is a very close relation between Wordsworth's notion of the subject matter of poetry and his notion of the language of poetry. How does this relation between subject matter of poetry and the language of poetry manifest itself? We have already discussed in our previous session how and why Wordsworth believed that the subject matter of poetry is closely connected with Mother Nature and with rustic life. So by extension, he also believed that the language of poetry ought to be the same as the language which is employed by the rustics, farmers and shepherds. Where Dryden asserted in his essay of dramatic poesy in 1668 that the best language is that of the king and his courtiers, Wordsworth rejected this erstwhile view on poetic diction, both in theory and in practice. In other words, for Wordsworth, good poetry should be written in the language of the lower classes. Wordsworth's view was a departure from that of the neoclassicists, who were deemed as themes or subject matter fit enough for poetry. Poetry that is written in the language also used by the upper classes. Now, why does Wordsworth insist upon the use of this particular type of language? T.S. Eliot has pointed out in The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, 1933, that Wordsworth was motivated by the democratic impulse instigated, of course, as we all know, by the French Revolution, to reject the language of the king and the aristocrats. This may be true to some extent, but essentially Wordsworth was advocating an organic poetic style. Wordsworth says, and I quote, "Low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that situation the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Because in that situation, our elementary feelings exist in a state of greater simplicity and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated. Because the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupations, are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that situation, the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. The language too of these men is adopted because such men hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. And because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse being less under the action of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. Accordingly, such a language arising out of repeated experience and regular feelings is a more permanent and a far more philosophical language than that which is frequently substituted for it by poets." Unquote. Because poetic style ought to be organic and not prescriptive, Wordsworth in these lines is advocating the use of the language of the common men, particularly the rustics, as he believes their language to be divested of all the artificiality, pretense and vanity of urban life. For Wordsworth, rendering rustic language into poetry has several benefits. For instance, rustic speech is emotional, passionate and simple. In highly emotional moments such as love, marriage, death and so on, the rustic expressions are unrestrained and natural. The emotions of the rustics arise naturally from their hearts without any external mediation, because of which the words of the rustics convey the fundamental truths of life in a clear, transparent and easily comprehensible manner, thereby making the language of poetry philosophical. And therefore, words that are used in common everyday life by rustic people ought to be the most suitable language for poetic expression as opposed to the words used by other men leading an urban lifestyle. Now, another question that arises here is, what exactly does Wordsworth mean by the phrase selection of language? For Wordsworth, the language of the rustics was to be used, but it was to be purified of all that is painful or disgusting, vulgar and coarse in that language. The poet ought to use the language of common men only after careful selection, because the aim of a poet is to give pleasure. And such a language without judicial selection may not cause pleasure, but instead it might lead to its opposite, which is a feeling of repulsion and disgust. The question that I leave you with at this point, my dear learners, is that when Wordsworth admits to a poetic license in tidying up the language of the common men, Does this affect the persuasiveness of his theories about common men? This is something you must ponder upon and answer for yourself. If, however, language ought to be selected, then how should this selection of language occur? How should it be purified to result in pleasure? Is it through various figures of speech? We must remember that Wordsworth was of the view that figures of speech should be organic to the poem instead of ornamental add-ons, and therefore he disliked the use of almost all poetic devices, including personification, allusions, similes, hyperbole, inversions, and so on and so forth. Metaphors and figures of speech, however, were not to him disagreeable in themselves. They were disagreeable, unwelcome, and unnecessary only if they were not organic, not intrinsic to a poem, but attached to it like a decorative device from without. Wordsworth says, and I quote, "If the poet's subject be judiciously chosen, it will naturally and upon fit occasion lead him to passions, the language of which, if selected truly and judiciously, must necessarily be dignified and variegated and alive with metaphors and figures." Unquote. Now, why does Wordsworth prohibit the use of metaphors and other figures of speech to dignify language? In Wordsworth's opinion, men tend to naturally speak in a metaphorical language when they are in a state of emotional excitement. The earliest poets, says Wordsworth, used only such metaphors and images which were the natural result of their own powerful emotions. Then, with the passage of time, the latter-day successors to these early poets admired this figurative language and referred to it as a poetic model. And therefore, their language was no longer the result of genuine, unique, and individualistic passion. These latter-day poets merely imitated the style of the earlier poets, and this gave rise to an artificial poetic diction. A mechanical, impersonal, repetitious, and exogenous phraseology in language thus came into fashion. The poet must, at all costs, avoid the use of such artificial poetic diction, not only when he speaks in his own person, but also when he speaks through his characters. Once he ceases to use complex poetic diction, the schism between the poet and his audience will cease to exist, and it is only then that the poet will truly become just another man speaking to other men. Wordsworth was also of the opinion that there cannot be any essential difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry, and that the only difference lies in the use of meter. And so, in order to dignify language, Wordsworth suggests that the poet add meter to the incidents and situations of simple rustic life originally expressed in the simple language of the rustics. This Wordsworthian idea was in stark contrast to the neoclassicists who advocated that the language of poetry is different from the language of prose. Wordsworth says, and I quote, "Now granting for a moment that whatever is interesting in these objects may be as vividly described in prose, why am I to be condemned if to such description I have endeavored to superadd the charm which by the consent of all nations is acknowledged to exist in metrical language?" To this it will be answered that a very small part of the pleasure given by poetry depends upon the meter, and that it is injudicious to write in meter unless it be accompanied with the other artificial distinctions of style with which meter is usually accompanied, and that by such deviation more will be lost from the shock which will be thereby given to the reader's associations than will be counterbalanced by any pleasure which he can derive from the general power of numbers. In answer to those who thus contend for the necessity of accompanying meter with certain appropriate colors of style in order, and who also, in my opinion, greatly underrate the power of meter in itself, it might perhaps be almost sufficient to observe that poems are extant, written upon more humble subjects and in a more naked and simple style than what I have aimed at, which poems have continued to give pleasure from generation to generation. Unquote. In these lines, we see how Wordsworth justifies the use of meter. The preface to the lyrical ballads, as H.W. Garrett in his book Wordsworth Lectures and Essays 1923 points out, is as much a defense of the employment of meter in poetry as it is a protest against the use of poetic diction. Wordsworth gives several reasons for the defense of meter, which are as follows. A. Meter is an additional source of pleasure because it can give pleasure even without the use of poetic diction, even when the language is simple, even when the language is naked. B. In using meter, the poet has simply followed tradition. C. Meter has a restraining and tempering effect on the flow of emotions and passions. D. Meter also softens the painful and the pathetic. How? The use of meter has a distancing effect because of which an element of pleasure gets intermingled with painful emotions. E. Meter imparts passion to words, grace and dignity to the lighter emotions, thereby increasing emotional intensity. And finally, F. Meter lends an unusual quality to the ordinary language of common people. The contrast so produced is conducive to delight. In this way, the use of meter provides pleasure through the principle of contrast and difference. And it is the reader's perception of similitude in dissimilitude or similarity in dissimilarity that not only gives him pleasure, but in fact, the reader's taste and moral feelings in fact depend upon the accuracy with which he perceives this contrast. In sum, the 5 basic principles of Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction are that the language of poetry should have a certain coloring of the imagination. 2. It should be the language really used by men. 3. It should be the language of vivid sensation. 4. There is no essential difference between the language of poetry and prose. And finally, the use of meter enhances the quality of a poem. Now, before we proceed to Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, a short note on the poetic process. Wordsworth delineates the 4 stages of poetic creation as follows. The first stage is that of observation. In the first stage, the poet observes objects or situations from the various phenomena of the universe, which elicit powerful emotions in the soul of the poet. However, the poetic expression does not take place at this very moment. Instead, the observations get stored in the heart of the poet. The second stage is recollection. This stage comprises that moment of tranquility when the poet recollects those emotions which were excited by the particular object or situation during the first stage. In this way, the poet's memory begins to exert its power in order to bring forth all that has been lying dormant in the unconscious since a specific period of time, and this time period could span weeks, months, or even years. Now the question is, what triggers the poet's mind to travel into a particular past experience or past experiences stored in his memory? And the answer is that a similar kind of object or situation or incident or character that he once encountered in the past recurs in the present and sets off this trigger of revisitation, whereby the poet's original emotion transforms into feeling and begins resonating with him. The third stage is filtering. This is where the poet clears all non-essential elements, thereby making his own unique, individual personal experience comprehensible to other men. And finally, the fourth stage is composition. This is when the actual composition begins. The poet attempts to convey through verse that which excites him in spirit. As the poet communicates his emotions through language, the act of sharing his pleasure with the readers becomes an integral part of the poetic process of creation. It is at this point that the poet truly becomes what Wordsworth calls a man speaking to men. Now let's begin with Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, one of the important subjects of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. Firstly, to Wordsworth's contention that there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and that of prose, Coleridge replies that there is and there ought to be an essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. The language of poetry differs from that of prose in the same way in which the language of prose differs from and ought to differ from the language of conversation, and as reading differs from talking. Coleridge gives a number of reasons in support of his view. First, language is both a matter of words and the arrangement of those words in a particular order. Now, words in prose and words in poetry may be the same, but their arrangement is different. The difference arises from the fact that poetry uses meter and meter requires a different arrangement of words. Now, for instance, in prose we can say he went to that faraway land, whereas in poetry we shall be conveying the same meaning by saying to that faraway land he went. So you see, my dear learners, that the order of words varies as we attempt to express ourselves in prose versus poetry. Through this specific example that I have just spoken about, it also becomes evident that sometimes meter is not a mere superficial decoration but an essential organic part of a poem. Hence, there is bound to be an essential difference between the language of poetry and that of prose because of the arrangement of words. Furthermore, Coleridge says that the use of meter is as artificial as the use of poetic diction, and both are the sources of poetic pleasure. So, if one is allowed, then it is absurd to forbid the other. Secondly, Coleridge objects to Wordsworth's view that the language of poetry should be the real language of men. Why this objection? Coleridge says that, and I quote, "Every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activity of his faculties, and the depth or quickness of his feelings. Every man's language has first its individual peculiarities, secondly the properties common to the class to which he belongs, and thirdly words and phrases of universal use." Unquote. Coleridge also says, and I quote, "No two men of the same class or of different classes speak alike, although both use words and phrases common to them all, because in the one case their natures are different and in the other their classes are different." Unquote. Now, for Coleridge, this aspect of the difference and variation in language applies as much to the speech of the rustics as to that of the townsmen or the city dwellers. In both cases, the language varies from individual to individual, class to class, and place to place. Which of these varieties of language, asks Coleridge, is then the real language of men? A very, very pertinent question to which Coleridge replies, each. But nevertheless, says Coleridge, each of these languages has to be purged of its uncommon or accidental features, such as those that are the peculiar result of a certain profession, family, or locality. Now these accidental or uncommon features have to be purged before language can become the ordinary or the generally spoken language of men. Coleridge says, and I quote, "Omit the particularities of each and the result of course must be common to all, and assuredly the commissions and changes to be made in the language of the rustics before it could be transferred to any species of poem, except the drama or other professional imitation, are at least as numerous and weighty as would be required in adapting to the same purpose the ordinary language of tradesmen and manufacturers. Such a language alone has a universal appeal and is therefore the language of poetry. A language so generalized, so selected, and also so purified of what is gross and vulgar will differ in no way from the language of any other man of common sense." Unquote. For Coleridge then, Wordsworth's insistence upon using the language of common men makes little sense. This is why Coleridge objects to the use of the word real in the phrase "a selection of the real language of men" by Wordsworth. Instead, Coleridge recommends substituting it with ordinary or lingua communis. Moreover, Wordsworth's qualifier for the poet that he be in a state of excitement is meaningless, says Coleridge. is meaningless for Coleridge because emotional excitement may result in a more concentrated expression, but it cannot create a more noble and richer vocabulary. Thirdly, Coleridge objects to Wordsworth's advocation of the use of low and rustic life as the subject matter of poetry. Coleridge argues this point by saying that first, not all Wordsworthian characters are chosen from low or rustic life. Characters in the poems like Ruth, Michael, the brothers are not low and rustic in the usual acceptance of these words. Secondly, their language and sentiments do not necessarily arise from their abode or even their occupation. The language and sentiments of these characters are attributable to causes which would result in similar sentiments and language even if these characters were living in a different place and pursuing a different occupation than the specific place and specific occupation delineated in these poems. Now, what are these causes? There are primarily two causes. A. Independence, which raises a man above servility as well as above frugal life and industrious domestic life. And B. A solid religious education, which makes a man well versed in the Bible and other holy books. The admirable qualities we notice in the language and sentiments of Wordsworth's characters result from these two causes and not from their rural life or occupation or their contemplation of nature. Given these discrepancies in Wordsworth's poems, then, for Coleridge, Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction was not commensurate with Wordsworth's own practice of writing poems. For Coleridge, Wordsworth wrote in a language that is impassioned, lofty and sustained, and therefore a type of language that is not spoken by the rustics. Reading Wordsworth's theories of diction and his poetic compositions in comparison, Coleridge wonders how to reconcile them in the following words that I quote. To me, it will always remain a singular and noticeable fact that a theory which will establish this lingua communis not only as the best but as the only commendable style should have proceeded from a poet whose diction, next to that of Shakespeare and Milton, appears to me of all others the most individualized and characteristic. Unquote. Even if they lived in the city away from nature, the characters will have similar sentiments and similar language if they were subject to these two causes. In the opinion of Coleridge, a man will not be benefited from life in rural solitude unless he has A. Natural sensibility and B. In the absence of these advantages in rural conditions, the mind hardens and a man grows selfish, sensual, gross and hard-hearted. Coleridge agrees with Aristotle's view that the characters of poetry must be universal and typical. They must represent some particular class as well as general human nature. Coleridge writes, and I quote, "Poetry is essentially ideal, that it avoids and excludes all accident, that its apparent individualities of rank, character or occupation must be representatives of a class, and that the persons of poetry must be clothed with generic attributes with the common attributes of the class, not with such as one gifted individual might possibly possess, but such as from his situation it is most probably beforehand that he would possess." In this sense, Wordsworth's characters are representatives. Given these discrepancies in Wordsworth's poems, then, for Coleridge, Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction was not commensurate with Wordsworth's own practice of writing poems. For Coleridge, Wordsworth wrote in a language that is impassioned, lofty and sustained, and therefore a type of language that is not spoken by the rustics. Reading Wordsworth's theories of diction and his poetic compositions in comparison, Coleridge wonders how to reconcile them in the following words that I quote. To me, it will always remain a singular and noticeable fact that a theory which will establish this lingua communis not only as the best but as the only commendable style should have proceeded from a poet whose diction, next to that of Shakespeare and Milton, appears to me of all others the most individualized and characteristic. Unquote. Fourthly, Coleridge also objects to Wordsworth's eulogization of the language of the rustics. specifically to Wordsworth's view that the best of language is derived from the objects with which the rustics hourly communicate. Now, what is the basis of Coleridge's objection to this Wordsworthian view? Firstly, communication with an object implies reflection on it, and the richness of vocabulary arises from such reflection. Now, the rural conditions of life are too simplistic to require any reflection. Hence, the vocabulary of the rustics is poor. They can express only the simplest, barest facts of nature and not the ideas, thoughts, universal laws which are a result of reflection and meditation upon such facts. Secondly, the best part of a man's language does not result merely from communication with nature, but instead from education, from the mind's contemplation of noble thoughts and ideas of the great masterminds of humanity. Whatever noble and poetic phrases, words and arrangement of words the rustics use are derived not from nature but from repeated listening to the Bible and to the sermons of the noble and inspired preachers. In this way, we see that although Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction is of immense value when considered as a corrective to the affected and artificial language of poetry current at the time, nonetheless, it is also replete with a series of contradictions and limitations. Coleridge's evaluation and exposition of Wordsworth's theory remains, to this day, one of the best examples of literary criticism. Thomas M. Racer, in his article Coleridge's Criticism of Wordsworth 1939, calls Coleridge's chapters on Wordsworth the finest critical essay in English literature. Norman Fruman, in the book Coleridge the Damaged Archangel 1971, finds these chapters to be by far the best of Coleridge's works. George Saintsbury, in the History of Criticism 1906, says that Coleridge was one of the finest critics of the world. René Wellick, in the History of Modern Criticism 1955, comments that Wordsworth left himself wide open to Coleridge's refutation. George Watson, in the book The Literary Critics 1964, is of the opinion that Wordsworth was badly out of his depth as a critic, and he credits Coleridge with providing notes for the preface itself, a preface that Coleridge himself famously claimed as being half a child of my own brain in an 1802 letter to Robert Southey. So, my dear learners, to sum up, today in this session we looked at the fourth aspect of Wordsworth's theory of poetry, which is the language of poetry. Now, following this aspect, we also briefly dwelt upon the four stages of poetic creation according to Wordsworth. Finally, we looked at Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry. Hope you have enjoyed this session. Thank you very much.